Making the complex understandable. Rush Limbaugh, the Excellence in Broadcasting Network, and the Limbaugh Institute for Advanced Conservative Studies. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of the program that Andrew McCarthy has a piece at pjmedia.com. And he's a new columnist there, having moved over from National Review. Now, to refresh your memory, Andy McCarthy was the man who, along with Patrick Fitzgerald, incidentally, prosecuted Omar Abdel-Rahman, the blind sheikh, who was the first guy to engineer the first blowing up of the World Trade Center in 1993. The blind sheikh and his buddies had massive plans to blow up bridges and tunnels and many of Obama's precious roads in Manhattan, New Jersey. And McCarthy prosecuted Omar Abdel-Rahman and won the conviction. In the process, he boned up on Islam, became an expert on Islam and Sharia law. And he loves to tell the story. Excuse me for just a second here, folks. He loves to tell the story how he started out believing that Rahman and his acolytes were fringe kook derivatives of Islam. And the more he studied it, the more he found that they were not kooks, and they were not fringe, they were mainstream. That Omar Abdel-Rahman and his acolytes, who believe in Sharia law everywhere, anytime, everywhere, are academics. They are trained and educated at the leading universities in Egypt on the subject. Far from being kooks, they are the defining elites on the subject. He tried to find evidence in the Quran that these guys were making it up, but it wasn't really there. He found just the opposite. So Andy's become an expert in this. It's become one of his passions in terms of what he speaks of and writes about. Well, recently, Michelle Bachmann and other Republicans sent a letter to the State Department expressing concern, and I'm really summarizing this part of it, expressing concern over the presence of Huma Abedin, so close to the powers that be in our government. She's Hillary Clinton's one of her top-level aides. Huma Abedin also married to Weiner. Her name is Huma Weiner, really. She's married to Anthony Weiner, the disgraced, sex-crazed, sexist congressman from New York. So her real name is Huma Weiner. But Huma's mother is best friends with the wife of the new Muslim Brotherhood president in Egypt. And there is essentially a Muslim sisterhood that she's a member of. And Huma's father was also likewise involved. So Michelle Bachmann and others have written a letter to the State Department wanting some clarification and wanting an investigation to find out if because the Muslim Brotherhood is not what they are portrayed to be. The Muslim Brotherhood is not the, what's the best way to put this? They're not, the good mafia. The Muslim Brotherhood is being portrayed as much as secularist, mainstream, non-radical, and Andy says, no, they're not. They are right down the middle, as radical as anybody else in jihad. And so it's a legitimate request from Michelle Bachmann. Well, McCain took to the floor of the Senate last week to have at Bachmann and these other Republicans. So Andy has written a piece here chronicling 1995 to the present of how our government has changed in its view of the terrorists who seek to wipe us out. Here are the salient facts, as he writes them in his piece. And by the way, he's written a book about this, too. Willful Blindness. It's his memoir about the start of our confrontation with Islamic supremacism as a domestic threat back in the early 90s when he led the prosecution of Blind Sheikh's New York jihadist cell. They carried out the 93 World Trade Center bombing. And now he's got a column, The Wages of Willful Blindness. Is it time for defenders of liberty to abandon the GOP? Because his point here is that the GOP mainstream is no different than the Democrats on this in terms of refusing to see the enemy as the enemy. Now, here are two salient facts. Andy writes, and once you grasp them, you'll know everything you need to know to understand the rest of the dispute. A, not all Islamic supremacists are violent. But the goal of all Islamic supremacists is the same, to coerce the acceptance of Sharia. The methods of pursuing that goal vary. Sometimes terrorism is used. Sometimes nonviolent avenues are exploited, meaning Islamic supremacists co-opt legal processes, the media, educational institutions, and or government agencies. But regardless of what methods an Islamic supremacist uses, his goal never changes. He aims to implement Sharia law. In Islamic supremacist ideology, Sharia is regarded as the mandatory, non-negotiable foundation that must be laid before a society can be Islamized. Sharia is not moderate. Therefore, you are not a moderate if you want it, no matter what method you use to implement it. For example, if you are an Islamic supremacist and you want to repeal the First Amendment in order to prohibit speech that casts Islam in a negative light, you're not a moderate, even if you wouldn't blow up buildings to pressure point. The second thing to understand is this: Islamic supremacism is not a fringe interpretation of Islam. It is probably still the minority interpretation in North America, but nevertheless, it is the predominant interpretation of Islam in the Middle East. Poll after poll shows that upwards of 2/3 of Muslims in countries like Egypt and Pakistan want their governments to adopt and strictly enforce Sharia. That's why the Islamic supremacist parties in the Arab Spring countries are currently enjoying such success in elections. Now, with that background, understand that in the aforementioned 1995 trial, we proved that the reason the Blind Sheikh was able to run his organization was his globally renowned mastery of Islamic law. Omar Abdel Rahman is not a nut suffering from a psychological disorder. He has a doctorate in Islamic jurisprudence, earned by graduating with distinction from Al-Azhar University in Cairo, the legendary seat of Sharia scholarship since the 10th century. Now, we seem to understand all this 20 years ago. The government now would have you believe that Obama or Bush or Hillary or McCain or Condi Rice or Janet Reno knows more about Islam and its Sharia than Omar Abdel Rahman does. In other words, they say he's a kook, he's a fringe nutcase. He's not. Well, now observe the measure of how far off course we've drifted. In 1995, we demonstrated that, one, the Blind Sheikh was attempting to impose Sharia. This is all demonstrated in court, by the way. Number two, he drew directly and accurately from Islamic scripture. Three, his Muslim followers were animated by these instructions to push for the imposition of Sharia standards. For proving this in federal court, the Clinton Justice Department honored Andrew McCarthy and his colleagues with the Attorney General's highest reward. Today, by contrast, for doing exactly the same thing, namely for arguing that an authoritative interpretation of Islam directs adherents to impose Sharia by violence if necessary, in order to lay the groundwork for changing a non-Islamic society into one, McCarthy is routinely accused of promoting hatred and Islamophobia. Such accusations, applied to assertions of what used to be seen as fact, don't come just from the Obama left. The smears are echoed by prominent members of the Republican establishment. Now, McCarthy says, I haven't changed. The threat against us hasn't changed. What's changed is the U.S. government. The Obama regime and the Republican establishment would have us live a lie that endangers our liberties and security. The lie is this, that there is a difference between mainstream Islamic ideology and what they call violent extremism. This is what he learned in prepping for the trial against the blind sheikh. There is no difference. It's all the same. Omar Abdel Rahman is mainstream. Osama bin Laden, mainstream. Al-Zawahiri, mainstream. All of these are mainstream. They're not the kooks. Now, the vogue term, violent extremism, is chosen very deliberately. To be sure, we've always bent over backwards to be politically correct. Until Obama came to power, we used to use terms like violent jihadism or Islamic extremism in order to make sure everybody knew that we were not condemning all of Islam, that we were distinguishing Muslim terrorists from other Muslims. At a more sensible time, we didn't say German Nazis. We said Germans or Nazis and put the burden on non-Nazi Germans rather than ourselves to separate them. Anyway, he says here at the end, when Senator McCain and his lemmings rebuke House conservatives like Michelle Bachmann because they purportedly attacked Huma Weiner and her patriotism, there are two things at work. First, when the facts are against you, as they usually are against Senator McCain, demagoguery and character assassination are the most effective response. The compliant Islamophobic media will help intimidate your opponents into silence. We all are very familiar with this, but we often miss the second tactic, which is more important because it goes directly to our conception of patriotism, and it's this. The Obama left and the Republican establishment would have you accept the following premise. Anti-American Islamic supremacists are not an ideological threat. They're just a political movement, and therefore government officials want to treat them as a mere political movement to negotiate with them and accommodate them, are not endangering America. In fact, they're strengthening America. Consequently, if you dare suggest this is a lunatic way of looking at things, then you're a McCarthyite demagogue. Anyway, goes on to defend what Bachmann and the Republicans in the House are asking. The Muslim Brotherhood is not a harmless little offshoot here. They're not the mainstream where the others are the kooks. They're all together. Bachmann's inquiry is justified, and there's no reason to tar and feather her. It's a legitimate question to want to know if one of Hillary Clinton's top aides poses a national security threat because of her parents' close ties to Muslim Brotherhood. That's all they're asking. And McCain and the Republican establishment in the Senate went to the floor to trash Bachmann. And one of the things, I'll just add, I think there's an effort by the Republican establishment to take Bachmann out. I think they're lining up to campaign against her in her re-election effort. But that's another subject. Anyway, I mentioned this top of the program, and I wanted to make sure that I had this mentioned. I think Andy's going to be on Hannity's TV show tonight. If this interests you and you want to see and hear more about it, I got to take a quick time out right now. Sit tight. Back with more right after this. Don't go away.